This week, America switched sides. Ukraine is out, Russia is in. President Trump has blamed Ukraine for starting the war that was started by Russia, and America's traditional European allies are in a state of shock. Tonight, Trump's stunning pivot toward Putin and what it means for America's role in the world. Next.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again, from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic and moderator, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. There was a time when America could be counted on to support the goals of the NATO alliance, and that time was, technically at least, last week. This week, America's allies in Europe, partnerships that were formed in the aftermath of World War II, have been left wondering if they'll ever be able to count on America again. And they're not the only ones. From East Asia to the Middle East, from Panama to South Africa, leaders are scrambling to understand Trump's wishes and desires. I'll scramble tonight as well, with my guests Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent at the New York Times. Susan Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker. And Jonathan Lemire is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, as well as co-host of Morning Joe on MSNBC. Thank you all for joining me. We have news just as we were coming on set. President Trump has fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, Air Force General, four-star general, second black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Jonathan, surprising that he would fire him?
No, not at all, even though it's unconventional. Traditionally, these are roles the chairman stays through presidencies. But we heard from Pete Hegseth, the new defense secretary, some weeks ago, saying that he said General Brown should be fired. This was before Hegseth was confirmed to the Post, because Brown was too focused on the woke policies of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, which we know President Trump, to this point, has really targeted across federal agencies, including at the Pentagon. So this was something that had been widely expected would happen in the next couple of weeks. It happened moments ago.
All right, Peter, what does it mean for the military that they fired a general relatively quickly into his term?
Well, look, President Trump, in his first term, tried to assert control over the military in a way that went beyond what the normal commander-in-chief does, not just as a defense for the country against external enemies, but as a tool potentially for internal use when he had domestic criticism. And that's where he got into a fight, as you've written, and we've written, and you've written, and we've all written, with Mark Milley, the previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who resisted what he thought were at times certainly unwise, maybe illegal and unconstitutional desires by the president to put troops in the streets. So clearly there's a decision that C.Q. Brown is not somebody that he can trust to carry out his bidding, and we don't know what that bidding will be.
And you think that it's the acid test for Trump is willingness to put troops in the streets against American citizens?
It would be striking to know if he had not made a conversation about the Insurrection Act a part of any interview for who is going to take his place.
Right. And Susan, one more question on this. C.Q. Brown was characterologically or dispositionally very, very different than his predecessor, General Mark Milley. Milley got into trouble with Trump for speaking his mind pretty loudly. C.Q. Brown, one of the most cautious generals, flag officers that probably all of us have ever met. Very deliberate, very careful, very quiet. Didn't save him.
No, it didn't save him. Donald Trump has made it very clear that he wants people who are loyal to him personally and not to the office, not to the Constitution. And I'm looking for, Jeff, to understand whether this is just one firing or whether we're going to see a wholesale purge of generals, as a number of news outlets have been reporting. And I think that's of deep concern when you look at Trump's agenda. It really suggests a politicization of the nonpartisan leadership of America's armed forces if generals are being replaced on the basis of perceived political loyalty to the president. And I think, remember again, the U.S. Congress has a role in this. The Senate has to confirm Trump's new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I think it's an appropriate set of questions for them to ask as to why has this apparently a three-star general been elevated to this position, and what questions were asked of him by Donald Trump.
So I think we're going to be talking about the Insurrection Act in the coming weeks in a way that we maybe didn't think we were going to be, but we'll obviously stay on top of that next week. I want to pivot to the main subject tonight. The small subject of America's global alliances and the Alliance for Freedom that was established after World War II. Susan, I want you to walk us through what happened this week, but I want to read something that you just wrote in the New Yorker. One difference from Trump's first 4 years in office is that he has now adopted not only a pro-Putin take on Russia's conflict with Ukraine, but an approach to foreign policy overall, which echoes Putin's throwback view of the world as a playground for predatory great powers to exert nearly unlimited control over the smaller nations that fall within their sphere of influence. So with that as backdrop, describe what has happened over the last few days.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that, when you look at Donald Trump's view of Ukraine, he's always had a very dismissive view of Ukraine. And now we see him overtly over the last week taking steps not only to pull back on America's support for Ukraine in the 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion, 3 years this week, the United States, along with our European partners, has provided tens of billions of dollars in military assistance. We have essentially kept Ukraine in the fight with Russia. Donald Trump is not only saying no more military assistance to Ukraine, he now seems to be overtly parroting Russia's view of the war. And that, I think, was a breathtaking moment that we will remember, was what happened this Tuesday afternoon when Trump, in a press conference in Mar-a-Lago, explicitly said to Ukraine, it's your fault that Russia invaded you. How? It's inexplicable, but I think it bespeaks a shifting role for the United States in the world, where we are not only an uncertain partner for our European allies, for Ukraine, but many Europeans are now wondering whether we're outright adversaries. We seem to be taking Putin's side in this catastrophic and deadly war, the largest war in Europe since the end of World War II.
Peter, go back to this quote that Susan is referring to. Basically, that he said, despite what we see with our eyeballs, that Ukraine started the war. What is I'm not asking you to shrinkify the guy, but what's the thought process that leads him to say that Ukraine started this
Well,
war?
look, he's saying you could have made a deal, i.e. you could have given up your territory. You could have been like Czechoslovakia in 1938 and said, just take Sudetenland.
But why would you do that?
Of course you wouldn't do that.
Okay.
And of course Ukraine wouldn't do that. Nobody in Europe would have thought that would have been a good idea. And nobody in Washington would have thought that would have been a good idea until now. But you heard him switch, as you said at the beginning, sides in this. He calls Zelensky a dictator without elections. Now, Vladimir Putin is an actual dictator who has had only farcical elections for 25 years. Zelensky was elected in a free and fair election 5 years ago. It's true they're not having elections now because of martial law. They are in the middle of a war, but he is a popularly elected official. And no, contrary to what Donald Trump said, his approval rating is not at 4%. It's around 57%, which, by the way, is higher than Donald Trump's. What did Donald Trump say about Vladimir Putin today? What did he say about him this week? Did he reproach him for this invasion? No, he didn't. He said it wasn't Russia's fault. Vladimir Putin sent the tanks in, sent the planes in, sent the rockets in, but it's not Putin's fault.
Let me ask a very specific question. Given this new reality, and again, it's a febrile reality, so we don't know what next week will bring. But Jonathan, can Ukraine win by its own definition of what winning is, a war in which the United States is not helping?
They have said themselves they can't. The Zelensky has said that the nation is reliant on U.S. support, financially, military equipment, and the rest. Europe has stepped up. Europe has given as much as it can to this point. But Zelensky has said they cannot do. Now, there's some talk tonight that maybe there's some reporting tonight. There's a minerals deal of some sort might be close that would, for some sort of U.S. aid, but it's not clear if that's simply a payment for retroactively what the United States has already done, or whether that would mean more aid is coming. Just about an hour or so ago at the White House, Trump was asked if Putin was a dictator. Refused to answer the question. He has not done so again. We have seen time and time again, he has been deferential to the Russian version of this conflict. And what we've seen here, taken in tandem with what Vice President Vance had to say at the Munich Security Conference in recent days, seems to be a shift of the complete approach for the United States, not just to Russia, but to our longtime European allies.
Yeah. Jonathan, I want to stay with you, and I want to show you a clip from 2018 of a press conference with Donald Trump and featuring Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Jonathan Lemire with a different haircut.
Yeah, we're all younger then.
Well, just watch this for a minute, and we'll talk about it.
President Putin denied having anything to do with the election interference in 2016. Every U.S. intelligence agency has concluded that Russia did. My first question for you, sir, is who do you believe?
I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
That was a hinge moment in history, it turns out. That was a very important question that you asked. And the answer suggests that the reality this week is not a new reality, that this is where he's been all along.
Yeah, he is consistent in his approach to Putin. He has put point blank right then, who do he believe? The U.S. intelligence agencies or Moscow? He picked Putin. And I think we're also seeing there's a personal dimension to what we've seen this week, where it's not just that Trump is deferential and seems to have respect for Putin, but has none of it for Zelensky, who he called I believe, moderately successful comedian in a Truth Social post a few days ago, who has clearly had personal animosity since his first term in office. Let's remember, he pushed Zelensky to dig up dirt on Joe Biden, then Vice President Biden and his family, thinking that it would be allegations of corruption in Ukraine that he could use against him in that upcoming presidential election. That ended up leading to Trump's first impeachment trial because he withheld military aid. So he has had personal animosity towards Zelensky as much as some sort of, to a degree, affection for Putin.
Yeah. Peter and Susan, I want to ask you, you're both former Moscow correspondents. You have a lot in common. You might want to think about getting married. You both spent a lot of time, and you've written extensively, including books, on this. What is the attraction Donald Trump has for Vladimir Putin? Go as deep as you can.
Well, look, this is a central mystery still to this day, 8 years after his first election to president. We don't really have a very convincing answer. If you ask people around him who spent time with him, you get two answers. One, he loves strongmen. He loves people who are authoritarians. He loves Xi Jinping of China, Erdogan of Turkey, Sisi of Egypt. He called my favorite dictator. That he has some sort of a relationship or identification, perhaps, with people he perceived to be strongmen. The other answer you get from people around him is money. That in the end, Russia was the golden chalice he never quite got. That he wanted to build there, he wanted to make a lot of money there, and he therefore was, catering or kowtowing to Putin as part of a years-long effort to try to build in Moscow that never actually worked.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to note here is that he has Putin's view of the world, and from his perspective, Russia crushing its neighbor and incorporating it back into the boundaries of the former Soviet Union makes perfect sense. Look at how Donald Trump is threatening Canada, our very, very friendly neighbor to the north, and saying that it should become our 51st state. So when Vladimir Putin says, well, Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist as an independent entity, I think that, something deeply ingrained in Donald Trump as well. But frankly, I don't think the explanations are sufficient, Jeff. It's true that he has a generic liking for strongmen, but it's also true that he has had a fixation on Russia and on Putin for a very long time. There was a MASH note that Donald Trump wrote to Vladimir Putin when he appeared as Time Magazine's Man of the Year many, many years ago, before Donald Trump even entered the White House. He had a very specific, kind of admiration for Vladimir Putin that even exists outside of his time in the political realm. But again, let's not psychoanalyze Donald Trump. Let's look at his actions, which are remarkable, jarring, very consequential, and in many ways very un-American. The statements that he's made this week, I don't believe that there's a president of any of our lifetimes, Republican or Democrat, who would say such things about a murderous dictator in the way that Donald Trump has. And I think it's very important to be clear about that, and also to recognize that there are so many people who have been, sort of casting the fog of like, well, maybe Donald Trump, he's going to be a Reagan-esque Republican. He's going to support Ukraine. Let's just say once and for all, to cut through the kind of spin that many of Trump's enablers have been having, and to sort of say, like, yeah, Donald Trump has been very clear for many years now about preferring Russia and preferring Vladimir Putin.
Can I ask all three of you a question? Has there been, or is there now, a democratically elected leader of an American ally that Donald Trump respects?
I think our silence says a lot. We're all racking our brains.
Shinzo Abe of Japan.
He liked him.
Did okay in the first term.
What was the secret there?
Golf.
Flattery. Yeah.
Yep.
Golf and flattery.
Yeah. We reported in our book, in fact.
I'm asking for deep psychoanalysis,
No,
and I'm getting golf and flattery.
Well, this is the best in the
So
business.
in our
This
book,
is
we
one of our favorite
reported,
things.
we reported that Trump, remember, Shinzo Abe actually nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. In our book, we reported that Trump personally asked him to do it. Yeah. Right? Would you please nominate me? And
Peter,
Shinzo
I've
Abe
asked
said
you for
yes.
the same favor
I'm
any
going
number
to,
of
any day
times.
now.
Yeah.
It's going to be in the mail.
So so Trump asked Shinzo Abe, and Abe, unlike Zelensky, I mean, obviously it's a sillier request, but Abe said yes, he wanted to help.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else? Anyone currently? Shinzo Abe's gone, obviously.
No, I mean, he was okay with Boris Johnson for a stretch, but
That's about it.
that's about it. Yeah.
What is it about democratically elected leaders that turns him off?
Weak.
And that's where he's picking the fights right now. That's where the tariffs are coming. China accepted. Like he's targeting the allies far more than America's traditional adversaries. And what's so also part two of this, what's so interesting is he's a member of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party, was the Russia hawks. They prided themselves on being tough on national security, being tough on Moscow. And we've seen a little bit of pushback this week, some sort of suggestion from some Republican senators saying, well, we don't think Vladimir Putin's a good guy, but very little outright criticism of Trump. A little bit from Senator Tillis yesterday, a little bit from Senator Wicker, but beyond that, it is simply maybe Trump's misinformed rather than he's wrong.
Well,
One
they
name, by the
also,
way, Benjamin Netanyahu, just to mention.
well,
Yes, you're
Democratic.
he has a conflicted relationship with that.
He does, but
but
that's close.
Conflicted, and also a semi-strong man who's trying to change Israeli politics to make it easier for him to stay
Well,
in
and again,
power.
I think this point that's really important about these Republican officials is that some of them may have more traditional Republican views of foreign policy and of Russia, but when it comes to a choice between their quote-unquote deeply held principles and Trump, they tend to choose Trump. And I think Trump humiliated essentially his new national security advisor, Mike Waltz. There's an extraordinary moment in the White House briefing room just yesterday in which Waltz's own words were quoted to him, where he called essentially Trump a murderous thug who was responsible for the war. They said, sir, do you...
Putin.
Sorry,
Yes.
Putin. And they said, sir, do you still agree with this? And he said, no, I agree with Donald Trump on everything.
I want to read something from something that Vice President J.D. Vance said the other day. One of the strongest arguments against or for not staying the course with Ukraine. He tweeted out, while our Western European allies' security has benefited greatly from the generosity of the United States, they pursue domestic policies on migration and censorship that offend the sensibilities of most Americans, and defense policies that assume continued over-reliance. Now, put aside for a moment the question of the European cultural differences and what they do spend money on domestically. It's also true that America's European allies, for decades, have underspent while we have overspent on their defense. And so I'm just, wondering, I mean, to give their arguments some credit, could all of this rhetoric, all these threats from the Trump administration actually lead the Europeans to build up their own defenses in a way that's going to be less reliant on the American soldier coming to their rescue?
Yeah, that may be the ultimate response here. But look, the person who made Europe decide to increase their military spending in the last few years was Vladimir Putin, right? Trump badgered the NATO allies time and time again in his first term to spend more, spend more, spend more. A few of them did, but frankly, by the time he left office, still only about a half dozen of the allies met the 2% of GDP goal. By the time Biden left office after the full-scale invasion, suddenly it's now 2/3 of the alliance is meeting that goal, not because of Trump and not really because of Biden, but because of Putin.
Yeah, Jeff, I think you're right. This is an important point to make, that presidents of both parties, actually going back to Barack Obama and remember his defense secretary, Bob Gates, they pushed the European allies. They said, you can no longer rely upon an open-ended American security commitment. And, this was a theme for quite some time. And that's what led to the allies making this agreement that by 2024, they would agree to spend a significant percent of their GDP on defense. Now, Donald Trump wants to raise that to 5% of GDP to be spent on defense. And by the way, even the United States does not spend
5%.
anywhere near that. Actually, we're under 4%. I believe it's about 3.8%.
Right.
Yeah. So, the bottom line is that Russia's threat and its revision to the European order, that's going to cost everybody more money. And so I think you see a real shift. The question I have is, not only is the United States going to move away from Ukraine, but what about our NATO partners in Eastern Europe? What about the 3 Baltic states? What about Poland? Is their security now compromised by Donald Trump as well?
I want to come to that in 1 second. But Jonathan, I want to ask you this from the perspective of a White House reporter. There are a lot of different ideologies stuffed into the Trump team. There's conservative internationalists, there's kind of muscular interventionists, there's isolationists. How does that stew pot, how does that work in there?
Right now, it's confused. I mean, not just the National Security Advisor, but the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as senator, was very pro-NATO, very, in a Russia hawk. And this week we have seen exactly the opposite. When he and some of his colleagues spoke to reporters in Riyadh after the first round of Russian-U.S. talks from which Ukraine was excluded, no mention at all of the atrocities Russia has committed. No mention of all of the war crimes, the charges against Vladimir Putin. Instead, about the transactional economic opportunities, about a better relationship between Moscow and Washington. So there is diversity there. We saw Keith Kellogg, someone who is much tougher on Russia, today tweeted praising Zelensky, so with flying in the face of what Trump has said about him this week. But Kellogg also potentially sidelined from some of the Russian talks. We know how unpopular he is in Moscow.
You covered the first months of the first Trump term, and it's very different. The Mattises, Pompeos, and so on.
The adults are gone.
Rex Tillersons. The adults, you're saying they're gone?
Well, the guardrails are not in place. And the adults who are in the room right now, back then, had success pushing back.
I mean, you're saying Marco Rubio might be an adult, but he's not arguing
It is Trump's worldview.
And he's not in the room.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I want to come back to something, just a final round of something that was just brought up. This is a quote from the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, who said recently that the credibility of the United States depends on how this war ends. Not just the Trump administration, the United States itself. You agree?
I think so. It's such a dramatic course correction from where we were, from what President Biden said, how he pledged that the U.S. would stay with Ukraine till the end. And going back further, this is about everything that's been in place since World War II. And it seems that the Trump president's view is wildly different and seems like, yes, he wants the war to end, but he's not doing so in a way consistent with what has been traditional American values and foreign policy approach.
I think the message from Sikorski, people like them, is don't forget Kabul. You don't want to have Kabul happen on your watch, right? He's trying to keep them from completely abandoning Ukraine.
You mean a chaotic withdrawal, a chaotic collapse of Kiev?
Exactly. That you've set Ukraine on the path to what's happened in Afghanistan under Biden. You hear that from some Trump people saying that's the one caveat as he is catering to Putin is that they don't want a disastrous ending. That's the one thing he fears.
Susan, does Donald Trump actually care if Russian tanks roll into Kyiv?
No. No,
You
I
want to
don't believe
expand on
he
that?
does. Look, Jeff, he's been very clear. This is Russia's sphere of influence. He thinks that Russia has a right to do whatever it wants in its sphere of influence. He prefers Vladimir Putin. He's at the point of almost openly advocating this week for Vladimir Zelensky's ouster, whether it's through political means or otherwise.
So, in other
He
words,
has
he's
a
scared of the
regime change
pictures,
policy.
but he actually believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia.
I believe. It seems to me that he has a regime change policy for Ukraine.
Well, that's a heavy note to end on, but I'm sure we'll be talking about this in the weeks ahead. We are going to have to leave it there for now, but I want to thank our panelists for joining us, and I want to thank you at home for joining us as well. For more on the end of the post-World War II international order, please read Ann Applebaum's latest piece on theatlantic.com. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by...
In 1995, two friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% U.S.-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan for the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.